Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 8th day of December in the year 2015. It is an absolutely gorgeous day here in Appalachia. I hope that the weather is even close to being as good where you are as well. It is absolutely a gorgeous day, and we're looking at 4 or 5 days of warming temperature. I can't believe this. We're heading towards the middle of December. Projections are that here in southern Appalachia this Saturday we're going to be in the upper 60s. Our local Rotary Club does the bell ringing this Saturday for a number of outlets here in the region for Salvation Army, and I've been doing this for 20 years. This is the first year that we're projected to have temperatures close to 70 on bell ringing day. I mean, people are signing up in droves because they just want to be out for a couple of hours in this kind of weather. So glad you could be with us on this Tuesday, on this gorgeous day. It is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you ahead of time for your continued support of the Virtual Center, for your willingness to tune us in and comment on some of our programs. And I want to open today with a little bit of that, if I can. But I do want to encourage you to feel comfortable participating actively in the program by picking up the phone and dialing into our number so that we can get you on the air with your ideas and your thoughts and your concerns, your suggestions, or whatever. You may recall, if you were tuned in yesterday, that not too long after our second hour began, we did receive a call from our regular listener, Horst, who calls in on average about once a week, it seems. And I wasn't expecting to hear from him on a Monday, and of course he made the comment that he usually doesn't get a chance to phone in on Mondays. But we spent the better part of our second hour yesterday going over a number of issues, and in fact, I think I made the comment that if you check the archived broadcast of yesterday's program, I think you'll find that I made a comment that when I thought about where we went in the course of 45 minutes or so in our conversation, it was kind of like being back in a seminar in graduate school or something. It was just delightful. And I hope that if you did listen to it, you found it helpful and valuable. I made the point yesterday in the midst of the conversation, and I wanted to begin today by emphasizing it again, that no matter how good a presentation might be, it becomes better once interaction begins and once people begin to bat around the ideas and the suggestions and the thoughts and the philosophies and the attitudes and all the rest of it that make up a substantive presentation. And everybody, including the presenter, is able to learn so much more because of the dialogue or the conversation that results. And again, I remind you that in his introduction of our program, Bob Kincaid always makes the point to refer to our program as a continuing conversation. And of course, conversations usually require more than one person. And I understand, given the nature of the deliveries of the programming that we're doing, sometime it makes sense that the bulk of the delivery would come from one end. But the more participation, active participation from others we have, the better. And something else occurred to me as we were getting ready to go on the air today. And you can kind of write this off as my attempt to be semi-comical and at the same time semi-cute. I fired up the old Keurig about 2 minutes before we came on the air and poured myself a cup of coffee and brought it in and sat it down, and then we immediately proceeded to connect for today's program. One of the things that dawned on me as I did that today was that yesterday, with Horst calling and taking up so much of the conversation, of the program, one of the few times I actually ended the program with an empty coffee cup, because I was actually able to sip coffee while it was still hot and warm as a result of the conversation. When nobody calls, my coffee gets cold. The cup is usually full at the end of the program, and the first thing I do is have to go in and pop it into the microwave and warm it up so I can drink it. So if you are of a mind to give me the opportunity to drink my coffee while it's warm, then you'll take that as a hint and pick up the phone and give us a call and join in the conversation. Seriously, we would love to hear from you. Our number is 304-663-4676. Area code 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me in an email, I would love to hear from you, and I will, depending on the substance of the email, I'll share it with our listeners if it seems like something that more than just me would get a benefit from, more than I guess. But anyway, whatever. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906, lowercase, all one word, @gmail.com. And again, I call your attention to the fact that we do have a virtual center page on Facebook. So if you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our Facebook page. And I now am comfortable in saying that there's a lot on it. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've taken to putting more pieces on it, and they obviously are opinion pieces, and they are designed to offer an opinion on some of the contemporary issues of the day as they relate to some of the things that we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center. The intent of the program from the very beginning was to hopefully expand our listenership, not only for the Virtual Center, but for the Head On Radio Network as well. And I do know that we do have some listeners that we didn't have before. So not a lot, but some. And as I look back over the Facebook page this past weekend, I noted that there's quite a bit on there. There's 8 or 9 opinion pieces on a number of different issues that we've addressed or will be addressing or maybe should have addressed on contemporary issues of the day as they relate to the mission of the Virtual Center. And I would be very, very interested in your reactions and your comments on some of those pieces. So if you are able to do it on the Facebook page, if there is a comment section on there, I would love to hear from you that way. But again, feel free to drop me an email at waobrien906@gmail.com and comment on something on the Facebook page. Or indeed, the best way of all would be to use the number and call in at 304-663-4676. All I want you to know is that we do appreciate and want to hear from you, and that you will be welcome. And I think that's probably, I'd like to believe that this is one of those situations where a phone call will be reached with appreciation on the other end rather than threats or screaming or commentary or being shut off or cursed at or whatever. I've never done that. I don't believe in my entire life, and I don't intend to begin now. So we would love to hear from you, and I want to thank you. I mentioned that, in the opening that I did want to begin today's program by making reference to comments that we received on issues and programs or whatever, and how I do appreciate them. And one of the things that I have received, I mentioned this yesterday, but this past Sunday, I was fortunate to have a piece on the Common Core published in the Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia, and I've received a number of comments, and most of them very positive. Very honestly, people appreciated it and said they enjoyed it and that kind of thing, and I love that. But I did receive a response or a comment, a very extensive comment from one of the people that read that article, who is a retired teacher in New York. He's a retired math teacher, and he raised a number of issues about my approach to the Common Core. And basically, he was a little bit critical of the article, of my article, and saw in it an attempt to exclude people from commenting on the Common Core, except in certain conditions. And, in other words, he tended to see a note of exclusion in the way I dealt with the issue of the Common Core rather than inclusion and inviting commentary. And I told him in response, I replied to his comment and told him that none of that was, if it's there, it's unintentional. I would never intend to do that. And I said, especially with his particular credentials in the area of mathematics and the number of years he taught mathematics and studied it, and actually taught in a number of different levels of mathematics, all the way from beginning pre-algebra all the way up to the more sophisticated elements of math, calculus, and second year algebra and advanced algebra and trigonometry and all the rest of it. And I told him that, on the contrary, people with his kinds of credentials and his kinds of experience are the people whose opinion or whose positions on Common Core we particularly solicit. And I don't mean by me, I just didn't mean that we solicit here at the Virtual Center. But all of those people that are making policy and formulating reaction and decisions on the issue of the Common Core need to hear from somebody with his kind of credentials. And again, I told him I didn't have any credentials in math. But as far as the English language arts part of it was, I did feel, after being in the classroom for many years, I did feel somewhat more comfortable making comments that emphasized my experience in that area. But woe be it for me to try to tell anybody with his experience and qualifications in mathematics about the pros and cons, or the ups and downs, if you will, of Common Core in that area. And once we got that out of the way, we've actually had a fairly, I think, good exchange. He sent me quite a lengthy commentary on how he sees the Common Core and where he sees some of the fallacies. And he did acknowledge that some of the issues in it were good. He believes that that implementation has been a problem in a number of ways. Preparation for teachers has been a problem in a number of ways. The fact that a criticism of the Common Core, which I think is legitimate, is that it's too test sensitive. It's too measurement sensitive. And the program seems pretty much oriented towards the particular tests that measure progress, student progress. I see that approach to testing as very positive, but I also am aware of the negatives of testing, and I shared that with him. And her. I'm not even sure, very honestly, whether the responder was a male or a female. But I was very, very interested in the comments, in the problems of implementation that he presented. The fact that the turnaround time for measurement was too quick, given the degree of change that was being demanded of students. They were being asked to master too much too fast at too young an age. And he mentioned he believed that because of the nature of the kinds of changes in mathematics that youngsters were being exposed to in the Common Core, there needed to be much more orientation, much earlier orientation to this approach to mathematics. And, of course, he was also concerned that the development of the measurements, the tests, kind of lagged behind the implementation. In other words, he raised the question as to whether there should have been much more done in the area of development of the tests before the implementation began. Maybe there was too much pressure, too much of a hurry to implement the program too soon. And his concern was that in some of the lower grades, many of the students psychologically are not ready for the kind of intense pressures that Common Core would require. In other words, some of the substance that is in this exchange is so solid and so good and I think it's so valuable. And I know I learned a lot from it. I have learned a lot, and I want to take the time when I can get a little bit of time to respond much more substantively to some of the things that this particular person took the time to share, because I think it's very valuable. I don't want any of it to get lost, to fall through the cracks or anything like that. I think that it's all very valuable. One of the things that I did want to I wanted to spend time today acknowledging the quality of the exchange and of the input, and how much I appreciated it. But also, one of the things that occurred to me is the substance of this particular presentation, or this particular person's information and concerns to me about the program are very, very valuable. But one of the things that occurred to me at the very end, as I was thinking about presenting this at the beginning of today's program, the irony of all of this is that while the bulk of the specifics in this particular response, or in this particular comment statement, and which is fairly extensive, by the way, is that in a very, very ironic way, it substantiated the value and the benefits of Common Core. And as I thought about what kinds of comments this particular person was making about the Common Core, while they were presented in in kind of a negative tone, or a negative concern, in a very unique way, they did speak to the benefits of Common Core and to the need for it. In other words, most of the concerns and questions dealt with issues like implementation and timing and measurement and development of teachers, and all of this very, very important information as it applies to a substantial change like the Common Core brings to our mathematics classrooms. And in an ironic way, it seems to me to validate the need for the reform, because if many of the changes that are mentioned here were indeed implemented successfully, Common Core would be good, and I think this person acknowledges that. So again, it's not a criticism of Common Core. It's a criticism of the way it was implemented, the timing in terms of the implementation, the levels at which the different elements of mathematics are introduced, and those kinds of things. But the overall emphasis on skill development, and the overall emphasis on measuring student progress and being able to detect learning problems and challenges in individual students before they become too major and before the student begins to fall behind, are invaluable. And I think the comments that this person made substantiate that fact. So in reality, my concern, and this is what I'm going to respond in my comments, that overall it seems to me that we've reached a meeting of the minds, so to speak, and we kind of agree that whatever there is that's negative about this, those are the kinds of things she has pointed out. And if we can find a way to incorporate many of those things into the program, we can strengthen it and make it work better. His comments in no way suggested that Common Core should be shelved or scrapped or anything like that. And I think it's important. I think he's speaking or writing from the position of a teacher, a frustrated teacher, a heavily overworked teacher. And I think any reform program would do well to solicit and pay serious attention to these kinds of comments. And I wanted to make sure here at the Virtual Center that the person who took the time to put this stuff down in an email or in a comment, that effort was acknowledged, because I sure appreciate it, and I hope that those of you listening do as well. I mentioned yesterday that if we had gotten there, and we didn't, that I would like to return to an issue that we began in our last program, in last week's Virtual Center programming, and that is the idea or the issue of the so-called administrative state. And because it's been almost a full week since we've dealt with this, I think it's necessary to kind of begin or back up a little bit and kind of indicate or backtrack on where this issue came from and why it's an issue now, what has brought it to the fore, and why I believe that it's so significant that we devote some serious time to it here at the Virtual Center. I believe that this is quite consistent and quite important in the overall mission of the Virtual Center. I don't think we can ignore it. I think, in fact, I feel a little bit deficient myself because I haven't really addressed this particular issue yet, except on the edges. It's come up in a number of different venues, a number of different ways in previous programs, but never did I consider taking on the whole issue of the administrative state and some of the controversies and the implications of that as they affected the Constitution and as they affected the interpretation of the Constitution and the operations of government in the modern, complex, information-driven society that we currently live in. It seemed to me that, or it does seem to me that these issues really do need serious attention. At the end of early last week, I think, to be honest with you, I think on the 3rd of December, which probably would have been Friday a week ago, about 10 days ago, in other words, George Will, whose name all of us recognize, wrote an op-ed piece or an opinion piece in the in the Washington Post. George Will has written in the Washington Post since 1977. And as I mentioned when we first got into this topic last Wednesday, George Will in 1979, I think, was a recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for the quality of his writing and his reporting and his thinking and all the rest of it. He's considered to be one of the most noteworthy commentators, contemporary commentators on our society and on the world around us of anybody today. And he's a regular columnist in the Washington Post. I think he submits two columns a week to the Washington Post, and he's been doing that for years. As many of you also know, and who know George Will, he is a spokesman primarily for the right. He's extremely conservative in his thinking. He makes no bones about it. His columns are very, very consistent in that vein, or he's always on the right side of center, so to speak, in terms of his commentary or his ideas and perspectives. But like Brooks in the New York Times, who is the in-house conservative for the New York Times, so to speak, George Will is one who's on top of what's going on. Not only that, but he's considered to be one of the most informed and insightful spokesmen on some of the issues that are going on in today's world and in today's America. And so therefore, what he says needs to be taken seriously, not just by those who agree with him, but I think even more so by those who probably don't agree with him, and I consider myself to be one of those. George Will, in this piece in the Washington Post, made specific reference to Clarence Thomas and some of the decisions or positions, concurring opinions, that Justice Clarence Thomas has written over the during the last session, 2013-2014, of the Supreme Court. And he points out that in 4 decisions over the last several months, Justice Thomas has consistently taken an opportunity to berate the growth, the size, and the power and independence, if you will, from public opinion and scrutiny of the administrative state. And this particularly drew my attention as it affects our mission here at the Virtual Center because of the mention of Clarence Thomas. Those of you who've been following the Virtual Center for any time know that while we've devoted an awful lot of time to Supreme Court decisions and to the opinions, both concurring and dissenting, on some of the key opinions that so affect our society, we've done very little with Clarence Thomas because, very honestly, it seemed to me that Clarence Thomas didn't really contribute that much to these overall decisions. He was a vote, and a predictable and dependable vote, depending on what the issues of the time were. But in terms of penning significant dissenting opinions or even concurring opinions, I don't think I'd be too far off base to say that those who follow the Supreme Court closely have, on many occasions, spoken disparagingly about Justice Thomas because of the little insight and creativity he seems to have brought to the court in the 25 years that he's been sitting on it as a justice. But this particular issue of the administrative state suggests a new day for Clarence Thomas. This is the first time that he has really grabbed onto an issue and run with it, so to speak. And so based on what George Will said, I went back and looked at a couple of the concurring opinions in the cases that George Will cited. And I found, first of all, that there's quite a bit in them, quite a bit of substance. Many of them are rather lengthy, and they really say a lot. And I really believe that these do credit to the caliber of Justice Thomas's thinking. So I found that to be particularly valuable. In the course of looking at these dissents, and of course what Justice Thomas is doing is taking particular strong positions, particularly strong positions, against the administrative state and the growth and the general acceptance in today's world of the administrative state. But more specifically, what this means when considered against the Constitution as the founders designed it, created it, and oversaw its ratification. Specifically, Justice Thomas sees the rise of the administrative state in today's world as contradictory to the separation of powers that the founders wrote into the Constitution of the United States as a protection against runaway government. And Thomas makes this position in his concurring opinions. George Will cites the substance or the spirit, if you will, of those opinions in his article about the dangers of the administrative state as he sees it. In the course of reading George Will's piece in the Washington Post, about halfway through it, George Will makes the point that his thinking, his ideas, his concerns, and his renewed interest in Justice Thomas's performance are due to an article that appeared recently, I believe middle of the year, I'm thinking April, May, June, something, maybe May of 2015, in the journal National Affairs. The author of the article in question is Charles J. Cooper. This Mr. Cooper, Charles Cooper, is an attorney that served in the Reagan Justice Department in the 1980s. He's a prominent attorney, conservative attorney, and he wrote an article entitled "The Case Against the Administrative State." And it appeared, well, actually the title of the article, to be accurate, is called "Confronting the Administrative State," and it appeared in National Affairs. And George Will cites that article as being the source for his particular piece of commentary in the Washington Post. So I basically went back to the National Affairs article and read it very carefully. It's extremely comprehensive. It's a powerful article. It's a lengthy article. And it goes into the origins of the administrative state. It goes into the assumptions that drive the administrative state. And it also looks at many of the Supreme Court decisions and congressional decisions along the way that supported and really contributed to the growth of the administrative state. And it also emphasizes the same point that George Will did and that Clarence Thomas did, namely that the administrative state violates the separation of powers protections built into the Constitution of the United States by Madison, by the founders. And of course, we've done quite a bit with separation of powers, both in Federalist Number 10 and in Federalist Number 51. Federalist Number 51, of course, is Madison's paper in which he talks about the fact that of confronting ambition with ambition in order to create the kind of internal checks and separations within government itself. And so his basic argument, Madison's basic argument in number 51, is that the government under the Constitution confronts a dual challenge. And that is namely governing the nation, but also governing itself, because it recognizes the fact that while each branch of government is separated, legislative, executive, and judicial, and each branch of government is given very specific powers and authorities, a very specific charge, as it will. The legislative branch creates law or passes statute law. The executive branch, the president, enforces law. And the Supreme Court determines the constitutionality and ensures that the laws meet the criteria for justice. And the assumption that Madison made, of course, is that these separate functions, this separation of powers built into the system, is critical to the functioning of the republic itself. Madison, in one of his Federalist Papers, I believe it's number 47, makes the point that when these separate powers whenever these separate powers end up in the same hands, whenever the legislative branch of government is able to assume some of the executive powers from the executive branch, or some of the judicial powers from the judicial branch, when these separate powers are no longer separated and they are all in the same hands, that, Madison says in Federalist Number 47, is a definition of tyranny. That it is separation of power more than anything else that prevents the republic from moving in the direction of tyranny, of administrative authoritarianism. And indeed, in his article, Charles Cooper makes the point that the administrative state and the rationale behind the administrative state has been so successful in garnering and bringing these three branches of government together in the executive primarily in the agencies, the executive agencies that the office of president has created or been able to create over the years, the different departments and federal agencies, that it has caused the expansion and growth in power, influence, and expense of government to the point that we are approaching the tyranny that Madison warned us about in number 47. That has been the basis of Clarence Thomas's concurring opinions in the 4 Supreme Court cases decided in the 2013-2014 session of the Supreme Court. That's the issue that prompts George Will to write this major piece of commentary in the Washington Post. And that is the theme of Charles Cooper's extensive article in National Affairs, which is to warn the nation of the dangers of the administrative state. And in the course of discussing these, Cooper, and I want to go to him because that's basically the most substantive piece of all. Much of George Will's article merely makes references to things that Cooper mentions and elaborates on. So I went to Cooper because I think the issues are presented and developed much more fully, much more completely, much more understandably. So I think basically if Cooper's article is the basis for the issue, then we probably need to go to Cooper for our information. On the other hand, we need to look very, very seriously at some of the issues that Cooper raises. Let me be clear in what I mean. Cooper makes a very, very good argument about the threats to liberty that the founders spoke about, that Madison spoke about in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere. Should separation of powers ever break down? But I think it's important to understand that Cooper, as is George Will, as is Clarence Thomas, all of them are operating from an agenda that is clearly political and ideological. They are conservatives. They are conservative thinkers. They are approaching this whole issue from a conservative perspective. Therefore, they have a vested interest in calling the public's attention to the dangers of the administrative state. In no way would they ever want anything they said to be seen as support or endorsement of the administrative state. So therefore, they're going to look at the issues and events which contributed to the growth of the administrative state as mistakes, as errors, as violation of the intent and ideology and the ideals of the founders. In other words, much of what Cooper, Thomas, and George Will present about the administrative state are from a negative point of view. That doesn't mean that it's not worth looking at. That doesn't mean that it's not worth considering. But it does mean that that's the set of glasses, colored glasses so-called, under which they look at the evidence, they look at the sources. So therefore, for example, it's important to note that Charles Cooper is very, very meticulous and very selective in his treatment of the founders. And he's given, as most people who are arguing from an ideological perspective, and let's face it, the only people who aren't, in theory, are people who are writing entries for encyclopedias and dictionaries. Almost everybody who writes has an agenda. I have an agenda. Everything I write has an agenda. And that's the point. And so do they. And it's important to consider what they say against the agenda, or in other words, in the context in which it is written. Because that context oftentimes contributes to what is said and how it is said. And therefore, in determining the overall validity of what's in the particular piece of writing, it's important to consider these things. In some cases, a particular agenda doesn't really matter to the overall point being made. It's still a good one. It's still a valuable one. It's still one that demands response. But on the other hand, sometimes the agenda overwhelms the reading of the evidence to the point that the author needs to be called for that, needs to be called to account. And I think these things exist in both cases. All of this is in the context of background to this examination of the administrative state, which I think it behooves us to spend quite a bit of time on, not only today, but undoubtedly through the bulk of tomorrow's Virtual Center program as well. We've just gone beyond the top of our hour. It's 12 minutes after the hour, 12 minutes after 2 in the East. So that means we've got approximately 45 minutes left in today's program to deal with this issue and to deal with some of the issues and some of the content of that issue much more substantively. Let me share with you, and I think maybe I mentioned this last Wednesday when we first did this, and this is Charles Cooper's treatment of James Madison, of the Founders, and the origin of separation of powers. Cooper goes directly to Madison's Federalist number 51, and he quotes Madison extensively. We've read these, but I'm going to share with you the quotes anyway because they're very important. Madison said in Federalist number 51, quote, "The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." And that's a quote, the statement that many of us are familiar with. We've mentioned that particular statement more than a couple of times over the months here at the Virtual Center. Madison goes on in Federalist number 51, and I'm quoting directly from Charles Cooper's article. Madison, "It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" Unquote. We've looked at that particular statement very, very recently here at the Virtual Center. Then Cooper says the following: "Madison understood that just as man is corrupted by power, government will be corrupted as well. Thus Madison concluded, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But men are not angels," Cooper said. And so the Founders supplied opposite and rival interests to each branch of the federal government to make up for the defect of better motives. Unquote. So Cooper's argument is that Madison's Federalist number 51, as well as Federalist number 10, spoke of man's flawed nature as being the justification for government, and the desire of the different departments of government, branches of government, to secure more power than they are entitled to under the Constitution is in part driven by this desire for power, which is innate, which is part of man's nature, human nature, and therefore it must be controlled. In other words, what Charles Cooper is doing with Madison is grounding his criticism to come, the criticism of the administrative state that he's going to make, grounding it in the flawed nature of man on which the Constitution was based. And Cooper concludes by saying just that. He says, we can see then that there was a close causal connection between the founders' understanding of man's nature and the constitutional system of checks and balances that they crafted to preserve the separation of powers. But if one has a different view of man, one is likely to have a different view of the need for the separation of powers. I want to stop there for a moment, because I think this is a point in which we need to look very clearly at what Madison says, as well as the agenda that Cooper has in writing this article. Because I think this is an issue or a point at which they collide. Cooper is saying that Madison put separation of powers into the Constitution because man's nature was flawed and there's no other way to govern him. Man's nature is evil. Man is driven by self-interest. He's driven by greed. He's driven by the desire for power and accumulation of more and more goods. He's a threat to his fellow man because he's going to manipulate and maneuver situations in order to gain advantage. But as defenders of this definition of human nature would say, that's a good thing because others are doing the same thing to him. And it's that quest for power against quest for power, ambition against ambition, that Madison uses as the justification for separation of powers and checks and balances within our constitutional system. Here's my point. We know, because we've spent quite a bit of time on it here at the Virtual Center, we know that that is true as far as it goes. But we also know that that's not all James Madison wrote about man's nature. We also know from looking at Federalist 49 and Federalist 55 that Madison makes the point elsewhere that yes, this self-interest within human nature is there and it must be controlled. It must be never overlooked. It must always be considered and taken very seriously. And it can never be forgotten. But then Madison says, all of this is true, but there are also other features or characteristics of human nature which exist as well. And Madison says in Federalist number 55, there's also a good side to human nature. There are also features and characteristics of human nature which take us in a different direction, excuse me, and leave us in a much more positive frame of mind. And then Madison says, if that were not true, if man was evil, man's nature was evil and only evil, then Republican government itself could not function. if that really was all there is to say about man's nature, then popular government would not even be possible. And then Madison says something else. Madison says that beware of those who focus on the flawed nature of man's character in order to justify a position or an agenda based upon it. Because there's also to this other side of human nature. And if it's not acknowledged and it's not recognized as being there, then republicanism and popular government as we know it cannot exist. And Madison even said, if it turns out that the Constitution of the United States depends on man's flawed nature, if it turns out that the Constitution of the United States does not support and acknowledge the potential of Republican government. In other words, Madison says if the Constitution violates republicanism, then it ought not ever to be ratified. Basically, then, Madison is warning us of those who would overemphasize the negative, flawed nature of man in order to justify a particular political agenda. Let me put this into terms that are a bit pointed, but I think make the point. Madison is warning us of George Will. He's warning us of Charles Cooper. He's warning us about those who would manipulate the situation in order to promote a particular agenda. Cooper is saying that separation of powers is there because of man's flawed nature. Therefore, to eliminate separation of powers as the administrative state does, eliminates the only controls we have on man's flawed nature, the quest for power. And so the power and influence of the administrative state, Cooper is saying, is proof positive that Clarence Thomas is right, and that the separation of powers and checks and balances which prevented or protected the nation from tyranny have been lost, have been squandered. And therefore we have been put in the mercy of a super all-powerful administrative state, which is in violation of our Constitution, and therefore we need to get about fixing it and restoring separation of powers to the system. In other words, what Cooper is saying, what Thomas is saying, is the only way to check the power and growth of the administrative state is to reinvigorate the separation of powers which the founders put in the Constitution to control it. What I'm saying is you need to take that step one step further. And that is, in order to reinvigorate separation of powers, you have to return to the flawed nature of man on which its inclusion was based. You've got to reject any positives that exist in human nature. You've got to reject the potential of popular government and republicanism. In other words, you've got to contradict Madison himself. What am I saying here? I'm saying that Madison is much more complicated and much deeper and much more complex than Cooper, Thomas, and George Will give him credit for. They are taking one aspect of Madison's attention to man's nature, and they are ignoring the other. In other words, they are manipulating the sources in order to support their own conservative right-wing agenda. They want to destroy the administrative state. And the way that they want to destroy the administrative state is to take power away from it. And in his very last paragraph, Cooper tells us how he wants that to happen. Namely, the calling of a constitutional convention that will take power away from the federal government and return it to the states, which is the issue that we spent yesterday's program addressing. It's important to recognize they would never admit this, that the state governments to which they want to return power are governments which their ideology currently controls. What they are in effect after is the destruction of the power to govern of the federal government by returning power to the states to a degree that makes the federal government unable to function. And it puts the responsibility for governing back in the states, which they control. And yesterday we looked at a number of the amendments that the same ideological group would want to add to the Constitution in order to bring this about. It's important to understand those linkages and those complex arrangements. It's important to never, for a moment, overlook or ignore the political agenda behind these kinds of reforms, because they are extremely significant. Okay, I'm going to read directly from Charles Cooper's article. This is early on in the article, in which he addresses the issue of where the administrative state came from, what brought it into being. And he pins this principally on a name, on a person that we all know of, Woodrow Wilson. Many of us know that Woodrow Wilson was President of the United States during World War I. Some of us may know that Woodrow Wilson was also president of Princeton University. And right now there's a move to get Wilson's name separated from Princeton University because of the racism in the Wilson administration and in Wilson's writing and thinking. Wilson was a racist, and much of that was incorporated in his writings and in his policies, as well as in his administration as president. He was also governor of New Jersey, and one has to assume that many of those same ideas and attitudes were operative in his role as governor. Wilson also was a scholar. He was a political scientist. He has written extensively on government. He's written extensively on the British government, on the British Constitution. And he has written extensively on the kinds of attitudinal and administrative or political changes necessary to support what we know in history as progressivism, the progressive movement, the challenge to corporate control of the American nation. Wilson's support for progressivism and the ideological grounding that he gives it in his writings becomes the basis for the growth of the administrative state, which is associated with the progressive movement. So the administrative state as we know it is associated with progressivism, which is grounded principally in the philosophies and the writings of Woodrow Wilson as well as Theodore Roosevelt, to be very honest with you. Many of you remember that in the election of 1912, two progressive candidates, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, competed with a third, William Howard Taft, who was the Republican candidate. Roosevelt was the progressive candidate. Wilson was the Democratic candidate. Politically, we know that Roosevelt split from the mainstream Republican Party, and his determined decision to run as a progressive effectively split the Republican Party, and most scholars believe that it made Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912 inevitable. That's exactly the same political situation that many people are beginning to see in our projected presidential elections next year, the elections of 2016. There is an idea, a thought amongst those who study our election system that the successful candidacy of Bernie Sanders is drawing potential support away from Hillary Clinton to the point that it's liable to split the Democratic vote in ways which guarantee the election of a Republican president in 2016. Of course, that's exactly what Republicans want to see happen. Republicans are not at all concerned about Bernie Sanders. They want to do everything they can in order to support Bernie Sanders' success in taking political support away from Hillary Clinton. Many people believe that this happened with the election of George W. Bush. In the election of 2000. The third-party candidacy drew support away from the Democratic Party to the point that many people believe it made the election close enough that the Supreme Court could give it to George W. Bush. But that's another issue. I don't want to get into that. Let me go back to the text of Cooper's article about progressivism. This is what he says. As Justice Thomas noted in his Perez concurrence, that's one of the Supreme Court cases in which Thomas wrote a concurring opinion about the administrative state. The philosophy of the administrative state, and this is quoting Thomas, has its roots in the progressive era, unquote. Woodrow Wilson was one of the key thinkers behind the rise of the progressive movement beginning in the late 19th century. In his 1887 essay, The Study of Administration could be considered a sort of Federalist Papers for the administrative state, an explication of its political philosophy. And Wilson's philosophy was, at its core, motivated by impatience with the compromises and inefficiencies, that is, the checks and balances, deliberately built into our constitutional system, unquote. What Cooper is saying in this paragraph is that Woodrow Wilson's commitment to administration, to the administrative state, was an expression of his impatience with the compromises and the inefficiencies associated with separation of powers and checks and balances. features that were intentionally built into our constitutional system by the founders to control the desire to accumulate power. And then Cooper summarizes Wilson's 1887 article. Quote, Wilson began his essay by marginalizing the principles of the founding. Quoting Hegel, he argued that those principles are not timeless truths about the nature of man and government, but instead are, quote, nothing but the spirit of that time expressed in abstract thought, unquote. Wilson asserted that modern life is simply too complex for our founding principles, and that the modern era demands a government possessing the utmost possible efficiency, unquote. That paragraph is one that we need to spend time on, because that paragraph is proof positive of Cooper's ideological preferences, his agenda, as it were, overtaking his reading of the record. I have spent the last 3 days going through Wilson's 1887 essay on the administrative state. It's available online. It was published in 1887 in the Political Science Quarterly. It took me a while to find a copy of it online, but I did. Actually, it was about, I typed in on Google Wilson's essay on the administrative state, 1887, and I received about 7 pages of citations. I had to go into about the 3rd page of links before I found one that actually gave me access to the article itself. At that point, I printed it. I've been reading it. I've been marking it up, and I want to share some of it with you. Because what we're going to see is that Charles Cooper plays fast and loose with Woodrow Wilson. He accuses Woodrow Wilson of saying things and supporting things that Woodrow Wilson never exactly said. In other words, this is an example of political ideology, of a political agenda overtaking historical evidence to the point that the evidence is manipulated. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Cooper says that Wilson quotes Hegel in saying that the principles of the founding are not timeless truths about the nature of man and government, but instead are, quote, nothing but the spirit of that time expressed in abstract thought, unquote. In the article written by Woodrow Wilson, he does cite Hegel. And he does cite Hegel's comment that certain principles are not timeless truths, but oftentimes are the spirit of that time expressed in abstract thought. But here's the key. Wilson is arguing for administration, the study and practice of administration as a profession. What Wilson's entire article on the administrative state in 1877 is about the need for professional administrators, administrative leaders in government who are trained in the specifics and the skills necessary to administer properly. In other words, he's making an argument for administration as a profession. We know that he was successful. We know that most political science degrees, college degrees, have specializations in administrative studies. We know how many people who graduate from college with degrees in political administration or in economic development and administration. These are people whose profession, whose training is going to lead them into government positions where they administer the kinds of agencies that function in today's modern complex society. What Wilson is doing in 1787 is calling for, making a case for the need for professional administrators. And what he is saying is that up to that point in time, very, very few people considered administration as a specific skill or profession at all. That most, up until that time, most of the studies on government, on politics, were focused on philosophies and structures, the organization of government. We know how much time Madison spent looking at Federalist Number 10, at the organization of the federal government, how it would be organized in order to prevent and control the violence of faction. The whole focus of Madison's attention was on structure and organization. That's what Wilson is saying. That up to the point that he's writing, up to 1887, most of the attention of those who study government has been focused on structure, on organization, on constitutional theory, on the principles on which government is founded and built. Almost nobody, Wilson is saying, considers administration. The assumption is you just appoint people to office and they administer with no training, no skills, no specific skills, no specific understanding of what they're supposed to do. Wilson's whole article is based on the need for recognizing in a complex society that administration is a skill, is a profession, and therefore requires certain skills and talents and abilities that not everybody possesses. Only certain people possess. And in order to function well, government has to find these people and educate them and train them in order that government can function effectively and efficiently. It's here that Wilson goes to Hegel. He quotes Hegel about these things not being timeless truths, but are features of their own time, to back up his point that it's time to consider administration as a profession when nobody ever did before. And so what he's saying is it's time to begin to look at government differently than people looked at it in the past. He's not saying anything about human nature, about man's nature, man's flawed nature, a fallen man, and all the rest of it. Cooper's putting that in there. He's putting those words in Wilson's mouth and in Hegel's mouth when they are not there. Why is he doing it? Because Cooper's agenda is different. Cooper's agenda is not to study and explain and understand the administrative state. Cooper's agenda is to attack it and to destroy it. So in order to attack it and destroy it, he has to base it or found it on certain principles or attitudes towards human nature. And for that, he goes back to Madison. But he eliminates in Madison the places where Madison says that's not the whole story. Cooper's agenda requires that he make it the whole story. Clarence Thomas is doing the same thing. And George Will is buying into it as well, because we know George Will, and this is his story. This is why our young people need to be encouraged and taught the ability to read and understand critically. We can't let the Coopers and George Wills of the world tell us what Woodrow Wilson meant. We've got to read Woodrow Wilson. If you're going to base your whole point on Woodrow Wilson's defense of the administrative state, then we have to encourage people to look at Wilson, not go to those people with a political agenda who want to see or not see certain things in Woodrow Wilson. This little paragraph, which is just an introductory paragraph to Cooper's paper, is critically important because it reveals the degree to which the conservative right-wing agenda that drives this whole issue is really dominating the way they are using and manipulating the sources, the background, history, in order to make it say what they want it to say. Wilson did advocate the utmost possible efficiency. It's true. You can put that in quotes. It's in Wilson's article. He said that. But he didn't say, destroy the negative, flawed nature of man on which separation of powers was built in order to replace it with a much more positive attitude towards man's nature, which would justify the administrative state. He didn't say that. Cooper's accusing him of doing that, but he didn't do that. He didn't say that. Cooper did. Let's look at the next paragraph, and then we'll be done with Cooper's introduction. He goes on about Woodrow Wilson. To achieve this goal, Cooper says, Wilson insisted that, quote, we must discover the simplest arrangements by which responsibility can be unmistakably fixed upon officials, unquote, providing them with, quote, large powers and unhampered discretion, unquote. The concentration of unhampered power in the hands of experts, then, was for the progressive the essence of efficiency and therefore the genius of the administrative state. And since the most efficient form of government is one in which all power can be exercised immediately and without obstacles, it's not surprising that Wilson pointed to Napoleon's government as an exemplar of good administration. After all, what better way to streamline the use of power than to appoint oneself emperor, unquote. Look at where Cooper has taken Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson does cite the efficiency of the political reforms that Napoleon made. That doesn't mean that Wilson supports an emperor. Supports a state with the power and influence and prestige of an emperor. Wilson knows that many people are afraid of that, and he addresses it, but he doesn't endorse it. But it fits the agenda of this particular article to say that Wilson indeed does endorse it. What's the solution here? What's the answer? Well, it seemed to me that the only way to deal with this fairly, intellectually, and honestly was to go to Wilson's article and to see exactly what Wilson did say about the administrative state and to look at the case he made for it. In other words, it seems a bit shaky if you want to know about the administrative state to go to George Will and Charles Cooper and Clarence Thomas and learn about the administrative state from people who are committed to destroying it. People who are going to point out all the negatives of it and none of the positives of it. People who are so committed to the destruction of the administrative state that they actually will manipulate the sources in order to base the foundation and growth of the administrative state on things that Woodrow Wilson and Hegel and James Madison themselves were not totally committed to, but to allege that they were. We're moving towards the end of our program here. I've got 52 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 5 minutes left in today's program. At the very beginning of Wilson's article in the Political Science Quarterly in June 1887, he's talking about the kinds of political reforms that are currently, by currently I mean in 1887, underway in the United States. More specifically, he's talking about civil service reform. I'm asking you to do something now that I know is very, very difficult. But if you think back to your American history classes, you may remember that in the late 19th century, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, in other words, after the Union is put back together again, and government begins to function in the late 19th century, in the period that we usually refer to as the Industrial Revolution in America. You may remember that in the face of all the political corruption that was going on in the late 19th century, a reform movement began in the 1880s promoting civil service reform. In fact, some of you may remember that Congress passed legislation for civil service reform in, I believe, the 1870s. I believe it was the 1870s. Please don't hold me to the date. But it was in a piece of legislation called the Pendleton Act, which established the civil service reform system under which government employment would operate. The argument was that people needed to be appointed to government positions based not on who they knew or how much they were willing to pay under the table in order to get the appointments, but government jobs required skills and expertise, talent. And therefore, civil service reform or employment in government, since it was a public service, required that appointments be made on the basis of merit rather than on who you know or who you are worth or how much you're worth or what your family's name is or who contributed to the party or whatever. It was the idea of government appointments being based principally on merit. That was civil service reform. Wilson makes reference to civil service reform as the beginning of the process that he's talking about, which is the recognition of administration as a profession, a separate profession in and of itself. He says, it is a thing almost taken for granted. This is Woodrow Wilson himself, not Cooper. It is a thing almost taken for granted among us, Wilson says, that the present movement called civil service reform must, after the accomplishment of its first purpose, expand into efforts to improve not the personnel only, but also the organization and methods of our government offices. The purpose of civil service reform is not only to benefit the personnel, the people involved, but also the organization and the methods of government as it functions, as it operates. Because it is plain that their organization and methods need improvement only less than their personnel. It is the object of administrative study, Wilson says, to discover first what government can properly and successfully do, and secondly, how it can do these proper things with the utmost popular efficiency and at the least possible cost, either in money or in energy. On both these points, there is obviously much need of light among us, and only careful study can supply that light. This is Wilson's case in his very first paragraph, his opening paragraph, for the study of administration as a profession, a separate profession, that in and of itself, that is necessary in order to improve the structure and performance of government. So that's right at the very beginning of Wilson's argument. And then he gives us a little bit of the background. And he talks about the idea of administration as a branch of the science of government. And I think probably this is a good place to stop, because we've only got about 2 minutes left in our program today. My clock shows 2:57 in the East, so we've got less than 3 minutes to go in our program. So I think it's probably a good time to not present any additional information, but rather to sum up where we are. It seems to me we're pretty much ready to go into Wilson's idea of administration in tomorrow's program. I think many of you may know as much, if not more, about this than I do. I've never taken courses in administrative studies. But it seems to me when you read Wilson, you'll begin to understand administration as he conceived it, in the kinds of political reforms he felt were necessary in order to upgrade government performance to meet the challenges of the Industrial Revolution and the challenges of the late 19th and early 20th century. I think this is important historically, but again, it's important politically and ideologically, because there is a concerted effort intellectually to challenge the very structure and operation of our government itself. This whole case, this whole matter, is being fought out in a number of different venues, in a number of different situations. We looked at the Second Convention movement as one of them. This is yet another. We're at 1 minute before the end of our program, so let me take this time to thank you for your continued support for the Virtual Center. I encourage you to continue your support for the Head On Radio Network, and I want to thank you for your willingness to tune in today, and I want to invite you to come back and join us tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Be good to each other, and hopefully we'll all be able to get together again. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you.